Hi, this is Kevin Graves. I'm a student at LaGuardia Community College. This presentation, called Saeed of Others, is for my Philosophy of Society and Politics class with Professor Minerva Ahumada. And I'm going to be comparing the book Orientalism by Saeed with this idea of otherness that we've been studying in class. So, Edward Wadi Said was an interesting character. He was born in Jerusalem in 1935 as a Palestinian Arab Christian, which I thought was quite unique. He was granted American citizenship because his father was also granted American citizenship since he was in the military did military work for the Americans. And he lived as a child between Jerusalem and Cairo, back and forth. He went to school, and while he was in school in Cairo, he studied with Omar Sharif and with King Hussein of Jordan. They were his classmates. When Said was older, he moved to the States. He became a professor at Columbia, where he taught for many years. And one of his students while he was there was President Obama, when President Obama was a student at Columbia. And Said died in 2003 of leukemia here in New York. So Orientalism was Said's sort of most influential and famous work. It was published in 1978, and the topic and point of view of it was really that the West's view of the Middle East was very subjective and colored, mostly by the dominance that the West had over the Middle East. His work was very provocative, particularly it ruffled feathers of existing Orientalists who felt that he was a little crazy in his views. But for the most part, particularly in America, people really respected his views and thought it was quite a groundbreaking work, and shifted the point of view people had about how the West viewed the Middle East. I'm going to be pointing out the first chapter of Orientalism, is we're going to be focusing on, which was about the way the English viewed Egypt in the mid-1800s, whenever Egypt was under England's rule. So, Said first thought that Orientalism's philosophy was really to learn and dominate. That it might have started with the good intention of learning about another culture, but in doing so, what people start to learn, they start to think of as facts, instead of just an interpretation of facts, and that really colors their view, particularly if they're studying a culture that they are dominating at the moment. And he felt that the knowledge really itself helped lend to this authority, as he says, over the other. So he felt it was a very egotistical view of others that the English had of Egypt during that time. And one thing he also felt was that although the Egyptians might have changed and evolved, and things that might have been true about them before weren't true now, that England's view stayed pretty stagnant, that it was a stable view, and he felt this was true of most, not just Orientalism, but also most people who had this view of others. Men have always divided the world up into regions, having either real or imagined distinction from each other. What Said is really saying is that this is a phenomenon that's happened throughout time, that people have distinguished between me and you, between us and them, and it gives an historical context to Orientalism and otherness, that we've always done this. And even if these distinctions were not true, we still have them and hold them true, because what starts off as, like I said before, as learning or knowledge really starts to become fact for us. He really believed that this concept of otherness and Orientalism in particular showed an arrogance, that the West really felt that they knew what the Orient was like. They felt that their point of view of the Orient, how they saw it, was actually how it was. And they really felt that, that the Egyptians were inferior, that, as he says here, if they're not patently inferior to them, then in need of corrective study by the West. They needed some kind of course correction. It was really an arrogant view that England had of Egypt, that the Egyptians sort of were less than and needed, that the English were the all-knowing, all-powerful, and what they knew was right, and they would bring this knowledge to Egypt somehow. And I think it's really a cautionary tale, that if you are that arrogant, you're really going to demean the people beneath you. And one example of this is the way that plantation owners in the South, in the United States, before the Civil War, really viewed slaves as definitely others, as less than them, as even not human, as their own property. And we still see remnants of this today in the racial barriers we have in the States. It's obviously not as bad as it was during slavery, but there's still violence, there's still, fear, and this arrogance of otherness. And I say cautionary tale because I really would like to see us learn from these sorts of distinctions and otherness, and the way that demeaning others and seeing them as others and beneath you can really harm them and harm society as a whole. And on that point, otherness has been used as a political construct throughout time. Governments, armies have really sort of whipped people into a fury of we and them. So like we are, and how they do that is this sort of familiarity of the we and the strangeness of the other. They're really sort of, let's say look at during the Holocaust, the Nazis would point out the large noses of Jews, or they would demean gays and lesbians during that time as well. They would mark them literally with these tattoos. This idea of a triangle was the mark of a homosexual. And so it really distinguished an otherness and really made people, the other Germans, really whipped them up into a fury, and they really saw these others as strange. And creates unease and wariness and fear, and it really has been a political weapon to keep people at bay, and really does aid the conqueror. And Said really felt this was the case with Orientalism. He saw it as he says here, for Orientalism was ultimately a political vision of reality, whose structure promoted the difference between the familiar, Europe, the West, us, and the strange, the Orient, East, them. And lastly, Said's view of Orientalism, as he says here, in short, Orientalism is better grasped as a set of constraints upon and limitations of thought than it is simply as a positive doctrine. So he really saw Orientalism that the negatives far outweigh the positives, that it might have been considered a positive doctrine, as he says, that to learn about others, but and that is something that we aspire to, especially in America. We are a melting pot. We have a desire now in school to teach a foreign language at a younger age, to have people embrace all cultures and learn different languages and such. But we have to be careful not to look too much at the differences. We have to have a base foundation of sameness, that we are all human and we are all equal. And I think if we come from that point of view, then we can have a safer and more positive view of others as we learn about them. And I really, what I sort of compare the English's view of Egyptians during this time to is sort of the zookeeper observing his animals. The English really did see the Egyptians during this time through metal bars of a cage, and the Egyptians were the ones inside the cage for sure. So that's my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I think Said was an interesting man. He had a unique perspective through living both in Jerusalem and in America, through having this sort of interesting pedigree of being a Christian and an Arab and Palestinian. That certainly made me think differently about in my own thirst for knowledge of other people, it's definitely given me some thought about how to be careful not to distinguish too much, to really keep looking for the sameness as well as the otherness in other people.